Hi, I'm Jason Grover from ThatShelf.com, and we're here to talk about The Many Saints of Newark, the latest film from the Sopranos universe.
ThatShelf.
So, we've been talking recently about the latest James Bond film and whether that was sort of necessary. Here's another film that I don't really think needs to exist, but I'm kind of happy it does, and it's kind of nice to see. It's nice to sort of visit this world again, but it doesn't do anything to necessarily elevate what came before. It's just a reminder about how extraordinary the sort of the source material really is, and that's in the case the David Chase's Sopranos opera, the rise and whatever happens to this particular family in New Jersey, the sort of 90s mob scene, the newer generation, the generation that was afraid but still willing to go see psychotherapy, and all of that dynamic and as it played out. Tony Soprano and his family, that we grew to know all of their foibles. We had heard tell of previous events. We'd actually seen some of the events that take place in this film. Those who are close watchers of the film will see sort of Rashomon-like moments where when they're at the fairground, we had seen that as flashback in a Sopranos episode, and here we're seeing it sort of within context, which is indicative of what this entire film is, which is, again, wonderfully redundant and kind of gives us a little bit more texture. What were these guys like as the younger generation? There's a couple sight gags for people like Silvio, whose toupee sort of slides off, something that you would never actually see when Little Steven was portraying it, but nonetheless sort of plays out here. We can see the sort of type of vainness that would lead a man to eventually run a sort of strip club empire, as it were. The film sort of plays out with sort of a mix of a bunch of character actors, many of whom come from actually the stage. Leslie Odom Jr. is actually one of the main characters. Many people know him from Hamilton. Alessandro Nivola plays Christopher Moltisanti's dad. Moltisanti, of course, being Italian for Many Saints. Christopher narrates it. Michael Imperioli actually narrates it from the dead. A little sort of echo from Sunset Boulevard or Casino, or whatever you want to sort of echo, a throwback to. And it's not a bad framing device. It's like you are remembering the people that committed this, and it's basically it's sort of the original sins that would lead to the type of violence and type of behavior that will come after the fact. You can see how things sort of play out. One really interesting cast member is Michael Gandolfini, the son of the original Tony Soprano, who brings a sense of continuity, I guess it is. He's not the best actor in the world, but he certainly brings an authenticity to it. Actually, not the guy that they brought in to play the much younger Tony Soprano looked in some ways even more like the father. Interestingly, I thought that casting was really well done. You have Vera Farmiga playing the matriarch. Carmela shows up. You have all these sort of the characters, the sort of that we learned through the telling of the show. We really sort of see them come out. But the wrapping, the sort of everything that takes place in and around it, surround the violence of the Newark riots that took place in the late 60s, fulminated by a bunch of organized crime, and the real racial disparity that was taking place in the city, the sort of fracturing of the city, the suburbanization, the thing that would eventually lead to quote-unquote white flight. There's actually a silly joke about that, and all of that stuff that plays out. Shift to 5 years later, where you see the beginnings of something. And look, I don't know where they're going to go with this, but it seems like there's an opening here to tell that story, to tell the story from an African American perspective in the area, running the numbers game and the conflict between the Italians and the blacks and how that sort of plays out. We get the sort of hints, the beginnings of that here. And that's really a story that wasn't told nearly as much as maybe it could have been in the Grand Soprano story. We sort of had a much more, all that stuff was sort of isolated and had sort of culminated into the sort of death of a particular kind of mafioso. But the sort of more, the dynamics at play. It certainly was echoed in the show like Sopranos, but it wasn't specifically related to the African American experience. And I have a feeling that this film may be a springboard for whatever it is that they're actually going to end up doing on that front. It's directed by Alan Taylor, who's directed a ton of these episodes. He directed a bunch of it. Boardwalk Empire. He's an exceptional sort of episodic television director. Not super cinematic with his flourishes, but very much getting the most of what needs to be done, getting from point A to point B with enough visual flourish to actually make it work. It feels like a sort of a gritty indie film in the best way. It doesn't feel like it's so stylistically divergent from the show, but it certainly feels like you're sort of traveling back in time and visiting the sort of precursors to all the characters that we've grown to love in The Sopranos. It mostly works. As I said, I enjoyed it while you're watching it. It's a little bit long, as all these films are. You sort of felt the sort of tension at play. You felt all these coincidences that didn't really come out. These sort of sins, as it were. This sort of continuation, the sins of the father and how they affect the behaviors of the son in multiple ways. And you really do have even more overt echoes to other sort of gangster film masterpieces by having somebody like Ray Liotta show up. Ray Liotta, who absolutely sort of comes from the cinematic world of that. His role in Goodfellas is so iconic. He plays basically a grandfather here, but also a great uncle. He plays two roles, twin brothers, and it's actually really nice. I hadn't known ahead of time, so when he was gone, I'm like, oh, he's gone, and then he came back, and the way he plays the two different characters are actually really interesting. You sort of see. It's not such acting showcase, but it's like, oh yeah, this guy definitely knows what he's doing. It's really refreshing because, God bless Ray Liotta, he's not had the best choices sometimes. I think that he's been in some absolute masterpieces, but he's also been in some dreck. So I think this film, the way he's used, the way that they direct him, the way that he brings to account these two characters, I think they're both very believable. Either in the heightened violence and the sort of obnoxiousness, or the sort of much more taciturn, sort of beat down person who's there for a lifetime in prison. It's an interesting dynamic. I don't know how this would play for anybody that hasn't seen the show. I think it would be pretty frustrating. I equally do not think this is where you start. This is not how you get into Sopranos. This is not you watch the prequel and then go watch the sequel, as it were. This very much is an appendix, an addendum, something going backwards and filling it in. And we've seen that a lot. We can forget the whole Star Wars nonsense. Just look at The Hobbit. I know a lot of people hate The Hobbit, but The Hobbit really works as like, let's just do more of the stuff that we loved. And it doesn't take away from anything we did. Fills in a couple things that sort of make us warmly reminisce about what took place. But, let's just kind of let it do its own thing. Solo comes to mind. Again, not to obsess about the Star Wars stuff, but Solo's a film that really felt like it didn't need to exist at all. It answered questions that nobody was really asking. Where did your name come from? Whereas, to its credit, this really is, in some ways, flushing out some of the hostilities, the sort of stuff that was always there, but you never really got an even deeper sense of where the anger and where the passions came from at that time. Where tiny little events would eventually butterfly effect their way into massive turmoil that would come within the next few decades. So yeah, I think the film is strong. I think it's very enjoyable. I'm glad it exists. I think it's a nice sort of a revisit of the world of Sopranos. I don't know where they're going to take it after this. If we see more stuff with these particular characters and see the sort of rise of Tony Soprano as he goes from this sort of late adolescent into, or early 20s guy, into something much more, that's sort of filling in that blank. Again, I don't think that's necessary, but it'll be interesting to see how they actually play it out, and go from there. So yeah, the Moltisanti film, as it were, giving some background to Christopher's background, and showing how it all ties to the general family, as it were, of the Sopranos world. For thatshelf.com, I'm Jason Gorber. Thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe. Please follow us on social media, and we will see you next video. All the best. Take care.